Hi, I'm Mark, producer of Roundtable, the TV series born here in New York City at the legendary Manhattan Neighborhood Network Studios. The exchange of ideas is important, and that is why we bring to you the following presentation. Please watch.
Good evening and welcome to Single Shot Show at Manhattan Neighborhood Network's Roundtable. Tonight we will be talking about street photography. We discussed the subject quite a few times, but this year, between epidemic, quarantines, political activism and many other things that was happening in New York, it was indeed a completely new page in life of street photography, giving photographers completely new material and completely new approach. And in order to look into it, we invited friend of the program, Hank O'Neill. Hello, Hank, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, Alex. It's great to be here.
Yes, so let's talk a little bit about how street photography is now in New York of 2020 and how it compares with what it was before. As I understand, you was photographing streets of Big Apple since 80s.
Well, actually, the first things I took outside in New York City were in the, like 1977, 70, in that range. But I took more things in the 1980s, and then as time progressed more and more, until today, I've taken an awful lot. Because I'm 109 years old, I've been trying to put together an inventory of what I've done. And it's right now I have about 120,000 files of street photographs from all that time up until now. The preponderance, of course, are after digital cameras came in. Probably two-thirds of it is after digital. But the stuff on the street was interesting in 1976, and it's just as interesting in 2020. I mean, there is always, no matter when I go out, there has never been a day that I didn't find at least one really good picture.
Well, I can imagine.
And it's fun and it's good for me. It gives me exercise, and I keep walking around and things.
Well, so probably we can.
I'll keep doing it.
You definitely should. And probably it would be good to start chronologically from now and see how the contemporary scene for street photography, contemporary atmosphere, the narrative looks for somebody who's seen a long history of what was happening in the city.
Well, when I first started pursuing specific projects, the first one I pursued was about 1981. And one major difference between 1981 and 1985 and 1990 is that you rarely, in those years, saw anybody on the street with a camera. And as a matter of fact, in the places that I was normally walking to, and that was sort of the rule, you had to be able to walk while you were there. I mean, I might take a subway to a certain neighborhood, but you walked. You didn't ride or take cabs or buses or anything. Mm-hmm. People often didn't go into those kind of places with cameras because in 1983 or something like that, parts of the Lower East Side were not as outsider-friendly as they are today. And I mean, it used to be that I lived downtown on Broadway, and I would walk across, say, 13th Street, and within 3 blocks, I would find burned-out buildings. And I remember talking with a friend of mine about an artist who had an exhibition in a gallery space that was sort of a bombed-out space. And he gave me the address of it, and and this was exhibitions in the late 1980s, and it was a block from St. Mark's Church on 2nd Avenue, which is now a very lovely neighborhood.
Absolutely,
and,
yes.
and things. So it was just a little bit different. And today you will go out and say walk down Bowery or walk down Broadway or walk down wherever, and you'll find people with cameras taking pictures of not only their dog or something like that, but street art. I mean, I have any number of photographs I've taken of people taking photographs of street art.
And so photographs of people who was photographing street art.
Yeah, and so that's one of the major differences. I mean, there are people out there doing it, consciously doing it, beyond the. I mean, sure, the men and women who are painting the murals and doing things like that, they always have people with them who are documenting what they do, or they document it themselves. But there are other people, hangers-on like me, who are wandering around and catching them painting. And generally speaking, the people that I've engaged on the street, doing that, I mean, they are uniformly nice, uniformly smart, uniformly doing good pictures, doing good work, and most of them are doing it legally, as opposed, and they're painters. They're people who can use a brush. They aren't just somebody with a spray can squiggling. Now, those kind of things happen at 3 o'clock in the morning when I'm generally not there.
Yeah.
So,
you're saying to most of the part reaction of people documenting what they do artistically is positive, and that was the same story back in 80s, I would imagine. It was different.
I rarely ever encountered anybody that was actually doing it. I mean, today you'll see somebody up on a scaffold doing a mural, and in some instances, I mean, they have lifts. I mean, they have equipment and everything that they're working with. But that's not the. You see, I'm come from the music business, not the photo business. And one of the things that I enjoyed more than almost anything in jazz is the improvisatory nature of it. And one thing that continues to interest me and always did, particularly when I first started doing street art stuff more seriously in the 1980s, was that I looked at some of the things that were happening as improvisations on a wall. Because it's like there's a quartet playing at the Village Vanguard, and they play their 3 sets or whatever, and at 1 o'clock in the morning, a saxophone player comes by and joins them. And then a little later, maybe a trumpet player comes by and joins them. And then it's a totally different kind of a band. Well, if you have something on a wall, be it a painting or advertisements or whatever it is, it looks a certain way at a certain time, and then somebody will come along and maybe draw a mustache on somebody, or they'll put up a sticker, or and eventually the wall gets bigger and bigger and bigger and full with more, and this is an improvisation on a wall. That's how I look at it. Now maybe that's silly, but that's sort of what it is. It's people adding and layering and putting their take on certain things, and to me that's interesting. And quite frankly, I honestly believe that many of the things that you find on walls on the Lower East Side or out in Bushwick or wherever you want to go are just as interesting as what you find in the galleries that are in those neighborhoods. And quite often, the people who are doing the things on the walls, wind up in the galleries. I mean, the first street artist that I consciously took a lot of pictures of this man's work, I had no idea who he was, but it's now 40 years later, and in 1981, he was doing things on walls. Of course, he was also doing things in his studio, but by now, his auction high is about $400,000. And I mean, the very first project that I undertook that, it had more than a dozen pictures, was one that had about 150, maybe 200 pictures that I took in subways in New York City. And on one of them, and it was all of the same advertisement that had been graffitied and messed with. On one of them, up at the top of the sign, Basquiat has written his tag. And that's in 1977, 78.
Well, Basquiat,
And he became reasonably famous.
and he always was linked to Subway. At one point, he was going around and giving his flyers on Subway cars as well.
That's right.
Yes, he always was part of the history of New York subways.
So
Well,
it was interesting then. It is equally interesting now. There are wonderful things to be found out on the street, and it's like an ever-changing museum as far as I'm concerned. And you never know exactly what this exhibit's going to be when you turn the corner.
Oh, ever-changing museum. It's actually a very interesting comparison when you said that it's similar to improvisation. But let's take a little break and let's talk a little bit about the narrative of those images after that.
Okay.
Hello, this is Alex AG from Single Shot with another single trick. Tonight I want to tell you a little bit about post-production. There is one feature in Photoshop and many other photo editing programs that being used scarcely. That's channels. And there is only one reason why it is so. Nobody understands what it is for. Well, not nobody, but a lot of people don't. So when you see an image just like this, you are getting in channel that. And that's very counterintuitive because you actually supposed to be seeing this. 3 separate sets of color, not of grayscale. So if you would think of each channel as specific color, for example, of red being red instead of grays, blue being blue instead of grays, and green likewise, you'll find channels very useful for editing. All right, we're back, and we was talking about the narrative of graffiti. Naturally, nowadays, just because of the reason why all this space became available for them, the plywoods and the windows, it's carrying the political message primarily, the social justice message. But what it was in 80s, was it the same or it was different?
Well, it was socially oriented, and it was protest, and it was anger. I talked to you I mentioned the thing about the Basquiat tag that I had seen in 1977 or 78. I had a friend named Bert Stern who was really a fine photographer, and about that time, Bert did a shoot for Tareyton cigarettes. In those years, Tareyton cigarettes had a slogan that was called, "I'd rather fight than switch," and it featured a very pretty girl with a black eye, and it was saying that she would fight to keep her Tareyton cigarettes. And then when people became concerned about tar in cigarettes and things like that, Bert did another campaign where they had Tareyton light cigarettes, and they had another pretty girl, except under her eye, instead of a big black eye, they had a white thing, and the tagline was, "I'd rather light than fight." And for whatever reason, you were talking about the walls, the plywood walls. Well, imagine every subway station up and down the IRT and the BMT and whatnot. They had big spaces where big posters were put up. This is where Keith Haring used to put up his black paper and make all those wonderful drawings that he did in the subway. Well, in this instance, Tareyton Cigarettes put up all of these ads for their light cigarettes. And for whatever reason, sociologically, I've never figured it out, but you would go into a subway station that had 50 ads or 20 ads or whatever, and if half of them were Tareyton cigarette ads and half of them were for automobiles or whatever, the only ones that would be graffitied and messed up were the Tareyton ads. And what would happen, you would have written across the pretty girl's forehead the word cancer, or this will kill you. And the young people who were in the subways were revolting against smoking cigarettes. And to me, this was interesting because in 1977, more people smoked than they do today.
I would imagine, yeah.
A lot more. But the people in the subways were worrying about this from the standpoint of the illness that it caused. And they were writing all sorts of medical kind of things on these Tareyton cigarette ads. So much so that I remember I wound up taking a couple of hundred or more pictures of one. I remember spending an entire day in the subway, going from station to station to station, taking these pictures. And I finally got enough of them together that, and I've never smoked, so I'm not a good person to narrate about what smoking does to you, but I thought it would be interesting to take these pictures of the smiling girl with the word cancer written all over her face and juxtapose them with pictures of people actually dying of cancer. And I talked to the people at Sloan Kettering and said, would you let me take pictures of people dying and run this and maybe scare some people? Very much in the same way that they run those ads on television probably right this minute. That says, I smoked, and, some poor person who only has half a face left or no foot or whatever because they smoked. And the people at the hospital says, no, we have to protect our patients. Okay, fine. So I never did that project. I just took the pictures, and that was that. But in terms of what you were saying, yeah, the common linkage from now until back then, as you said, much of the stuff that turned up on these plywood walls was protest. Yes. Black Lives Matter, or something hateful about the police, or whatever. George Floyd, and so forth. But that's sort of the common link. It's usually people who are angry at some aspect of the system, usually younger than older. Although I do know one person who's in his 80s who is still putting stuff up, which I think is quite admirable.
Indeed.
But and sounds pretty good. But anyway, but that's the common linkage. It's a form of protest, just or poking fun at somebody. Sometimes it's just for fun, but as often as not. And particularly with the plywood stuff, because of what was happening. Although the plywood artwork, much of it was closer to being finished artwork than the average thing you would see on a wall.
No,
I mean, because the people who encouraged the artists to do this, supplied them with paint and brushes, and they wanted something attractive to be on their stores or on their facilities, the Museum of Modern Art store down on Crosby and Spring. They boarded everything up. They didn't ask anybody to do pictures on their walls, so people just put things up. Across the street at Balthazar, they actually hired or asked a couple of artists, and they did, formal things all the way down the street. And I saw those in June, and then recently, by recently I mean maybe a week or two ago, I walked by, and they had a whole new set. Balthazar's is still closed, but they had a whole new set of paintings up, and that was charming, and they were good. But the linkage is generally protest, anger, or something, letting off steam.
And the tone didn't change. It was still angry graffiti back in the 80s, and it is angry graffiti.
Some
in
of
this
it was
situation.
angry, some of it was just, much of it was political. I know a friend of mine just issued a book that's called Presidential Conversations, and he asked permission for the use of a picture that I had taken in, I don't know, 12 years ago or something, where somebody had morphed a photograph of Lincoln into a photograph of Obama. And it was really quite a, it was an artist named Ron English, and he's very, very good. Here was this picture that I'd taken in 2010 or whenever it was. And we had used it in a book, and he wanted to use it again in the book that he had just put out. But that was a serious political statement with all the other stuff that was in the picture of those two men together.
Wow, that's indeed pretty serious political statement, and I'm sure that the artwork was quite interesting. Well, we have only a few minutes left, so after the break we might discuss a little bit about particulars of the process, basically how the street was treating photographer back then and how it does now. Today in Single Shot I'm going to tell you how to make a makeshift pinhole camera. It's actually very simple. All you need is a business card. I'm gonna use mine, but you can use any. You need to apply 2 pieces of duct tape on it, just like this, so they will be overlapping each other. And right in the middle of the cut from the inside, pierce a small hole. The smaller and rounder it is, the better will be your result. And put this contraption right on the camera, so the hole is right in the middle of the lens space. Then point it at what you would like to take a picture of, put the camera on delay, and take the shot. Voila! You have your pinhole camera shot. Thank you, and watch us on YouTube. Good. Alright, we're back, and we was promising to tell about some particulars of how the process of street photography different back then and now.
Well, as I said earlier, there were today you encounter other people doing it. In 1980, I didn't. But more importantly, today there are elements of it that are quite mainstream. I mean, the first people who talked to me about the pictures that I was taking of the plywood was the Museum of the City of New York, who want to acquire, pictures and things like that for their archives, because it is an important event that's going on in New York City, and
Yes.
the documentation of it is an interesting.
Yeah, back in '80s, it definitely wasn't
No.
part of what
Oh,
they
gosh,
would
no.
consider history of New York.
It
indeed.
was who was getting away with what, and who was getting caught and had to go to jail, or things like that. I mean, it was serious business. I mean, somebody tagging a wall. I mean, the majority of all of these things on plywood, this is all legal work. Nobody's
Yes.
going to put you in jail for this. In 1987 or 88 or 90 or something, there was an element of danger, not so much to me taking a picture, but to the artists who were doing it, whether they were painting on a wall or spraying this or that or putting up a wheat paste or whatever. I mean, it's become a mainstream thing. I mean, after all, JR is one of the most famous artists in the world today, and he's a guy who wheat paste pictures on God knows what. If he had been doing that 25 years ago, they would have. I mean, they tried to bust Shepard Fairey and put him in jail. I mean, it's a totally different kind of thing today. Although there are still people who are out there sneaking around late at night, putting up things that the police would suggest that they not do. But that's the primary difference, is that elements of it's no different than in 1980 you couldn't say certain things on a recording. That today, I mean, you can say anything you want to on a record and it'll be released and sometimes played on the radio. Things that would have put you in jail in 1980. Things change.
Yes.
And that's the primary difference, in that much of the street art is mainstream, and most of the people who are doing it want to get in galleries and have shows. And that's wonderful.
Just like
because I
rest of
think
the
it's the stuff that they're doing is terribly exciting.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Hank.
Thank
it
you.
was very insightful.
Always fun to
and
be
it's
here.
really interesting to compare what was happening back then and now. Things are not as different as you would think they are. It's
It's
actually
just
great.
they don't go to jail as often.
Which is very good.
That's right.
Whenever the artists have more freedom,
That's right.
the whole world
The
benefits.
world benefits totally. Thank you.
I hope you found that worth watching as much as I did. I'm Mark for Roundtable. Thanks for watching. See you next week.